5 books and counting. The Tales from the Omni Vault continues to expand as a universe. Go ahead and check the links down in the description to get your copies today. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Omni Viewer, and this is a rare follow-up to a previous Author's Take On video. Normally the Author's Take On videos that I do are just one and done. But here I realized that there was something I meant to talk about in the first one, but I was running a little long and it just kind of slipped my mind. You see, the last Author's Take On video I did was about core elements and when a character is changed too much. The core elements, just to do a quick recap, are those things that are so intrinsic to giving each character in the world of fiction their own distinct identity that if you were to remove that element, you would completely change the character and make it unrecognizable. So those are the things that remain constant throughout. No matter how the character might be reinterpreted, those elements usually still remain. And if they don't remain, then you're probably not dealing with that same character anymore. You might very well be dealing with an in-name only iteration of that character. However, there is another aspect to that, which is to ask the question, what about those times when you make a drastic change and it does work? How does that happen? Does that destroy the theory, or is there a reason for it? Now, I kind of touched on this in the original video by bringing up Marvel's Blade. Although the thing is, Blade was kind of an odd exception. You see, prior to the 1998 movie, he was not half vampire. He was still a vampire hunter in the Tomb of Dracula comics, but he wasn't even the main character of those comics. He was just kind of a generic side character. And everything we know about Blade today basically originated in that movie. Although you could argue that the reason it's a little different there is because the original Blade really wasn't that interesting. He was kind of a generic archetype, let's say, with nothing really to set him apart from other characters, aside from the fact that he was a black man in the 70s, which by the time you get to the movie in 1998 would have been outdated. So they had to make some updates anyway. But they added other things like making him half vampire, making him a solo act, and so on and so forth, that basically took this forgettable character and made him memorable. That's sort of an idea where you had a foundation to work with, but nothing had really been built on top of it, so then you're building on top of that to actually make something interesting. But what if you've got something that already exists, and you've got an established lore and depiction and whatnot that fans like and accept and everything, but then you go in such a radical direction that it's completely contrary to everything we know up to that point, yet it's accepted anyway. One example for the many Godzilla fans in my audience is when GMK, Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah Giant Monsters All Out Attack, depicted King Ghidorah as a good guy. In every other iteration prior to that, King Ghidorah had been a villain. Now, one of King Ghidorah's core elements is that he's always Godzilla's opponent, and that technically was retained in GMK. But previously, Ghidorah had always been depicted in a specifically villainous role. That didn't always mean Godzilla was the hero, mind you, but Ghidorah was always evil, or at the very least a tool of evil. Yet in GMK, he was a good guy. That is about as far as you can get from what you might also consider one of King Ghidorah's core elements, that he's a bad guy. And yet, GMK is considered the highlight of the Millennium era of Godzilla films, and is considered by some to be one of the better Godzilla movies of the whole franchise. So, why did it work there? And what about other examples we might be able to point to? Basically, why do some drastic alterations work? Why are some of them accepted? Why do some storytellers get away with making those changes, but others don't? That's what I want to explore here, in order to make sure that we've covered all of our bases in terms of this whole how you depict fictional characters thing. Alright, I think that's enough setup. We can get to the main event now. The answer to this particular question is actually very simple, and I see no reason to beat around the bush, so I'm just going to get right to it. But first, I need to make something very clear, and I know I've said this in the past, or some variation of it, but I think it always bears repeating. The job of any storyteller is to tell a good story. Now, some of you might hear that and think, well, duh. However, there are a lot of storytellers in this modern day and age who seem to have forgotten this. They seem to think that just because they have told a story, they deserve accolades. And if they don't receive those accolades, if their story is rejected, that means there's something wrong with the audience. And I just don't agree with that. And I'm saying this, mind you, as someone who has written stories myself. The job of the storyteller is to make something the audience will like. The author is not entitled to praise. He has to earn that praise. That's the key. He has to actually put the effort into making a story as good as he possibly can. And that applies whether the idea is completely original or in a long-established series with an established fan base. Doesn't matter which side you're working on there. You still have to tell the best possible story that you can. Now that we've established that, let's add an extra layer to make it even harder. If you are working with an established property and you want to make a drastic change, your job is still to tell a good story, but you also have to make a really good justification for that drastic change. And that drastic change, ideally, needs to come from a place of understanding what you're working with. Again, we can look back to Blade as an example. True, I did establish earlier that we were looking at this character as an example of a foundation was laid and nothing was done with it until many years later when somebody decided to build atop it. But when David S. Goyer wrote that first Blade movie, he came from a place of understanding the original Tomb of Dracula comics, and also understanding vampire fiction in general. So he wasn't making that change just to make a change. He was making a change based on what was available and what would make sense. A similar thing can be said with GMK, but an even more extreme example. Now, Shusuke Kaneko originally envisioned GMK as a movie in which Godzilla would fight Varan, Anguirus, and Baragon. Toho stepped in and said, actually, you're going to take out Varan and Anguirus and replace them with King Ghidorah and Mothra because they're a bigger audience draw. But otherwise, you can keep the story as is. Now, Kaneko realized, of course, that if he was to keep the story as is, but put King Ghidorah in one of those roles, that would mean King Ghidorah would be in a very different position than he's ever been before. And if the movie didn't work, that change would be rejected by the fandom. It wouldn't necessarily be the biggest problem per se, but it would certainly make the list of the myriad of problems fans would list off if the movie didn't do well. So Kaneko put a lot of effort into making the movie as good as he possibly could, so as to make this change palatable and have it make sense within the context of the film. And he did this coming from a place of understanding, because he is a fan. Again, we're looking at a very drastic change here, but because effort was put in, because the focus was on making the story as good as it possibly could be, and ensuring that everything was done in such a way that fans would like it and therefore accept something like such a massive change, well, it paid off. Like I said, GMK is considered, at the very least, the high point of the Millennium era. Now, I realize I'm saying all of this in an environment that has grown accustomed to blaming fans for the poor work of bad storytellers. So, how can I prove that I'm not saying this from a place of fan entitlement? I spoke out against author entitlement earlier, but what if I'm saying that from a place of fan entitlement? And I just want things to be done a very particular way, and I'm only going to make exceptions based on my own preferences. How can I prove I'm not saying that? Well, for someone who's determined to hear that in what I'm saying, no proof will ever suffice. But I can present some very compelling evidence at the very least, because as I said, I'm an author myself. And my most recent book, which you can find a link for down in the description, actually does tie into this subject. This story, Hoofprints and Lace, Occult Mafia 2, is heavily based on the legend of the Jersey Devil, which is one of the oldest American stories ever. In fact, it's older than America itself. It is at least 300 years old. And of course, when I say older than America, I mean America, the nation, the United States of America. So this legend has been around for nigh unto 3 centuries, if not longer. And it's pretty well established. My book, however, takes some different directions with it. It hasn't been out that long, so I don't want to get into major spoilers here. I'd like you to actually read it for yourselves and be surprised by it. All I will say is that I go with the idea that there is the folklore, but then there's the truth behind the folklore. Think of it this way. The painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware depicts a real event, but it is not an accurate depiction of that event. That's kind of what I can liken it to without giving too much away. As a result, my depiction of the Jersey Devil is very different from other depictions, which surprisingly there aren't as many as you'd think, but even among those, it's very, very different. However, I came at that change from a place of knowing the folklore. I have spent years researching this stuff. The original legend and its variations, the way that legend ties into other legends from the Pine Barrens area, the alleged sightings of what might be the real Jersey Devil. I've looked into this for a long time, and I developed this different take starting from that. I include a lot of it in the book itself, actually, but like I said, I take off on the idea that the folklore didn't necessarily tell the true story. And while I was writing, I realized that because this was going to be such a different take, I had to really make sure that it worked. So I put a lot of effort into crafting this story to make it as good as it possibly could be. Did I succeed? Well, I'm not usually one to toot my own horn, and like I said, the book's only been out for barely even 2 weeks at this point. So reviews are only just starting to roll in. What few reviews there are have been positive up to this point. I'm still waiting to see what the vast majority of them will be. So at this point, I don't know what the general consensus will be. Even if, however, my particular depiction of the Jersey Devil is accepted and winds up catching on, long term it will still probably be known specifically as my version of the Jersey Devil because I made those changes. But that's okay. If it's separate from the original version, that's just the way it is. There is one more thing to consider, which harkens back to that initial video. Towards the end of my last author's take on, I brought up an analogy, which I did not originate myself, about how fictional characters are akin to rubber bands. You can stretch them, but you can only stretch them so far before either they snap back to their original state or they break. Now, that's where the analogy usually ends, but we must also remember that not all rubber bands are created equal. They have different colors, they have different sizes, different elasticity, there are different kinds of rubber bands for different purposes. And some of them you can stretch plain across the street, others you can only stretch far enough to hold a handful of pencils. It's gonna vary, and the same thing applies to fictional characters as well. Some of them are stretchable and malleable in ways that are just plain insane, others not so much. Sherlock Holmes is a good example of an especially malleable mythology, because that cast of characters and the world they inhabit and the themes they embody have been stretched in ways that you might not even think possible sometimes. There have been interpretations that put him in the modern day, whenever that modern day happens to be. There have been dramatic interpretations, comedic interpretations. There was once a Saturday morning cartoon called Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd Century that took the original Victorian detective and found a way to get him all the way into the far-flung future, where there are flying cars and moon colonies and holograms and semi-sentient robots. It sounds insane, and yet, surprisingly, it works. Yes, I have seen it. You wouldn't think it would be a good show. It sounds ridiculous, and yet they made it work because they put effort into it. They actually went back to the original stories quite a bit of the time and found ways of transplanting the ideas and the characters into a completely different setting from where they originally started. Sherlock clearly can be stretched pretty far. Getting back to our King Ghidorah example, he's usually a villain. He was a hero one time, and after that, never again. Every subsequent appearance, he has returned to that villainous role. The one possible exception was in IDW's first ongoing comic, Godzilla Kingdom of Monsters, which seemed to be going with the GMK interpretation of Ghidorah. But like so many other things in that comic, it was completely bungled. Ghidorah was in and out of that series so quickly they didn't even name him in the book before he was killed off. And the overall storytelling just wasn't that good anyway. It's hard to say whether or not he was meant to be heroic because he didn't seem any more or less heroic compared to any of the monsters that showed up in that book. But the inspiration was clearly from GMK, and it just didn't work there. So, King Ghidorah being a hero appears to have been a one-time thing. He was stretched in that direction briefly, and then returned right back to what he had always been. And that seems to be where he stays. King Ghidorah, we can therefore conclude, is not as malleable, not as easy to put into those different scenarios. I mean, heck, the recent Operation Jet Jaguar short that debuted on Godzilla Day features King Ghidorah coming back as a villain using the GMK suit. So, I mean, they're using that because it's available, but all the same, we are once again seeing Ghidorah return to that original form. Now that naturally raises the question of how do you know what the character's breaking point is? How do you know you've made too many changes? And how do you know whether or not it will work? Well, I guess the only definitive way to know is to just take the leap, make the changes, and let the chips fall where they may when you're done. However, if you're going to do that, you gotta keep all of this stuff I've been saying in mind. Your job is still to tell the best possible story you can and to justify any drastic changes you make. Otherwise, you're just gonna wind up with garbage. And boy, have we been seeing a lot of garbage produced from people who just didn't care, or who just couldn't find a way to make the changes, but made them anyway because they wanted to be different. Anyway, I hope all of that makes sense. Like I said, I probably should have covered it in the first video, but now the topic is the subject of its own video. And, I guess that's all I have to say for now. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. Thank you all for watching. Now be sure to head down to the description to check us out on other platforms, as well as find links to the 5 current books in the Tales from the Omni Vault universe. Again, thank you all, and we'll see you next time.